Hi everybody, and welcome to the Who's the Boss? Library as Employer workshop. Um, I am Laura Berry. I'm the current library director in the Newington Library, and I am a former trustee and chair in the Epping Harvey Mitchell Memorial Library. I've also worked in a number of libraries, public libraries in the state, like the Plastow Library, the Newmarket Library, the Weeks Library in Greenland, and also I started at the Byron G. Merrill Library in Rumney. So if any of you are from any of those towns, I'd love to know it. Do any of those sound familiar to you folks? What role do you play there? And it's really nice to meet you. I'm also interested in what size libraries you all are coming from today. So do we have any folks from tiny libraries like Newington, smaller than 3,000 population? Oh, smaller than 1,000 even? Okay, yeah. And what about between like the 3,000 to 6,000 size? Okay. Bigger than 6,000? Bigger than 10,000? Well, okay, so some of you from the bigger libraries may have different setups because sometimes the board of trustees does not have supervisory authority in some city libraries, and there are a few libraries that may not qualify, may not be the RSAs might not apply to precisely from other sizes as well. But the majority of libraries in the public libraries in the state are governed by RSAs. So in this presentation, we're going to answer the question, who's the boss? And it's sort of a trick question because in some ways, the library director is the boss. And in other ways, the library trustees are the boss. And so we're going to go over the ways that the New Hampshire RSAs inform these roles, and then we'll have a question and answer period at the end with myself and my colleague Rosemary Darcy, who is the Minot Sleeper Library in Bristol's trustee, and she will be available to answer some of your questions about um, trustee roles and complement my perspective. So first of all, what we're talking about here is an aspect of the library that before becoming a trustee you may not have given a lot of thought to, which is the library as an employer. So there are other things that libraries are. They are public buildings. They are maybe community centers. They're obviously a place where you check out materials and access resources. But the library is also an employer of the staff and the director. So we want you as board members to know what the legal responsibilities are that you have toward your employees, and understand what the New Hampshire RSAs say about those responsibilities. So in a nutshell, the director manages the library day to day. The trustees hold the director accountable for how they manage it, and the legal responsibilities that the trustees have should inform the policies that they design for the director to use to run the library, and there should be a system in place to enforce those policies and those legal responsibilities. So that's what we're going to go over in this presentation, starting with the director as the employee and what the RSAs say about that, the Board of Trustees as employer and what the RSAs say about that, and then go into the board's specific responsibilities, some of them, And then also talk about federal statutes. Most of the others we're going to be talking about are New Hampshire statutes, the RSAs, which stands for Revised Statute Amendments. So it's sections of statutes. But there are also federal laws that affect all employers. So that includes libraries. Okay, so first section we want to talk about is what do the RSAs say about the director as an employee of the library. So here are 3 RSAs that apply to that, and they are sections of one RSA that is called RSA 202A. And I want to encourage you to, if you have not already, read the entire section of RSA 202A, because it is the majority, though not all, but the majority of the board's legal responsibilities to the library. So you're going to want to know what's in that. And yeah, there's a lot of legalese in it, but it is important for you to be familiar with. But today we're going to talk about specific ones, so specific sections. But I definitely still think you should read the entire. So first of all, we have RSA 202A-15, which speaks about the librarian specifically, or the library director, whichever one your library calls them. So, the librarian shall have education of sufficient breadth and depth to give leadership in the use of books and related materials. The librarian shall be appointed by the Board of Library Trustees for a term of office agreed to at the time of employment and until a successor is appointed and qualified. RSA 202A-16 says, in addition to any other duties which the librarian may be delegated from time to time, the public librarian shall, 1. Serve as the administrative officer of the public library, and 2. Recommend to the Board of Library Trustees the appointment of all employees. So the next slide is going to talk about this last one, RSA 202A-17, so we're going to hold off on that one for a moment. But let's just take a look at these two, because these are what RSA 202A says about what legally the library director or librarian should be able to do. They should have education to give leadership in the use of books and related materials. We'll skip this next sentence for a moment. They also, in addition to duties which the librarian may be delegated, they must serve as administrative officer, and they recommend to the Board of Library Trustees the appointment of all employees. So these are the things: leadership in books and materials, administrative officer of the library, and recommend the appointments of employees. So those are what you legally want to be thinking about when you are hiring a library director, because the law says those are what your library director should be able to do successfully. Anything else that you want your library director to do is something you are delegating to the library director. So you're going to need to spell that out in other ways. And we'll get to those ways in a moment, but an obvious way would be the job description. Another way is the policies. But the job description and the policies are going to complement this RSA in terms of what you expect from your library director. Okay, so the next slide is about this final one here, which I'm paraphrasing, which is, because the first two are quotes, but this one's a paraphrase. RSA 202A-17, library employees are not at will. If you are a library trustee and you've never been an employer before, you've never had supervisory responsibility, you've never had any HR kind of experience, you are maybe not aware that in the state of New Hampshire, most employees are at will. So, or maybe you do know that even if you haven't had, HR experience, but because maybe you've been an employee, and you might be aware that what an at-will employee means, or an at-will employer, is that an employer can dismiss you without cause at any time. Well, that is not the case with library employees. So it's pretty important that you understand that when you are the employer of the library, that, and this is what it says in the RSA 202A17, no employee of a public library shall be discharged or removed from office except by the library trustees for malfeasance, misfeasance, or inefficiency in office, or incapacity or unfitness to perform the employee's duties. So what this means is you have to demonstrate cause in order to get rid of a library employee. That includes the director, but it also includes any staff member. So there needs to be a disciplinary procedure in place that is followed for any dismissal of an employee. Also in this RSA 202A17, which you should read in its entirety, it refers to the fact that a public hearing is the right of any employee who is dismissed. They have to ask for it within 30 days of the dismissal, if I'm remembering right, but you should definitely read that entirety yourself so that you are aware of what your obligations are in the event that you dismiss an employee. And understand that this is a potential for legal action to be taken against the library in the event that you terminate an employee if you have not demonstrated that they were bad at their job in any of these ways that this RSA describes. Okay, so looking at the slides that we just talked about, the information we've been given, so we know what the RSAs want you to find in your library director, the specific things that they're looking for, the abilities that the library director should have, and the duties they should have. And then also that you have to demonstrate if you need to, if you want to terminate the employment of any of your staff, then you need to demonstrate that they were not competent in various areas. So these right here are the tools that you will use in order to create your expectations and then enforce them. So I'm sharing as an NHLTA member, taking a step back and seeing as one of the board of directors on NHLTA, and then also, I hear directors talk and I'm aware of, some board dynamics here and there. I would say my generalization would be that the biggest cause for conflict in these roles between library director and trustees is unclear expectations, or at worst, undefined expectations. So this slide is giving you 4 ways that you can set clear expectations. So the first one is the job description. The second one is the interview and hiring process. The third one is the contract. We'll come back to that one in the next slide. Fourth one is the annual evaluation. So these are the ways that you would tell the director, this is your job. So it would include what's in that RSA, right? You're going to want those things because legally you want the director to have the ability to do the things that are in the RSA. But also, this is how we want you to do it. So that's both going to be the other duties that you're delegating to the library director in this job description, but also how you want them to do it, what skills you want them to possess to be able to do it, and what different areas should be included. And then also, these are the terms you're going to do it under. The contract will define the terms. And then the evaluation is how you'll get feedback of how you're doing it. And there should be a relationship between these documents. They should not just be, you shouldn't just pull one off the internet. So, for example, the annual evaluation should bear a very strong similarity to the job description, because how do you evaluate whether the person is truly doing the job you want them to do the way you want them to do it if the evaluation isn't matched to what that is. So take the time as a board to come up with an evaluation that reflects what you are actually saying in the job description you want your library director to be able to do. And in this interview and hiring process, you should be looking for a candidate who you feel is qualified and capable of doing everything that's in that job description. And also, like we talked about, what's in those RSAs. All right, so now let's talk about the contract. In that first slide where about the library director as employee, where I talked about, or I read it about the different things that are specified about the library director, one of the things was a term of office. I use the word service here, but I should have written office. A term of office is agreed to by or at the time of appointment. So this is why I use the term contract when I discuss this, this RSA, this relationship, the responsibilities of the board and the director, because to me, if you're deciding on a term of office, it has a start date and it has an end date. Now, there are other boards. My board operates with a contract, but there are other boards that I'm familiar with that use an offer letter instead of a contract. But my interpretation of the RSA, when it says a term of office, is that there needs to be an end date in it, and that is not implicit to me when you're giving someone an offer letter. An offer letter does not have an end date, and so to me it's not consistent with the RSA. So my recommendation legally, and I'm not a lawyer, this is just my take on this, reading the RSAs, is that the contract should include the term of service, both when it starts and when it ends. And then it needs to include some other things that are what you're legally offering your employee. So it should say whether they're part-time and full-time, what number of hours a week that applies to, salaried, exempt, or non-exempt. Is everybody familiar with what those terms mean? We can talk about them more at the end if there's ambiguity about that, but in a nutshell, salaried exempt is when they work the number of hours that are required to do the job, but that is not a set number of hours every week. They're going to be paid a salary whether or not they work more or less than that number of hours. Non-exempt means an hourly worker, and they are subject to overtime if they work more than 40 hours a week or more than 8 hours a day, depending on how that is calculated in your library. The contract should also have a rate of pay and any benefits that this position is going to provide you with. So those are the things that should be included in a contract. And we need also to be very clear that anytime there's a change to any of these things, a contract should be revised and then re-signed, because it's now a new legal document, and you don't want to have, again, we want to have clear expectations, right? So if something's going to be changed, then the director needs to sign it, and also either the Board of Trustees in entirety can all sign it, or in some cases the chair may sign the contract. But it's important, because this is a legal document that the entire board is entering into, it's an agreement the entire board is entering into, that if you have just one trustee, like the chair, signing it, there should be a record in the minutes that the contract was voted on, and a quorum of the board, the majority of the board, voted to instate it and sign it. And so it should specifically say that the board is offering it, and that the chair or whomever it is authorized to sign on their behalf. Okay. So I have a feeling you're all going to have questions about the contract thing, and we can talk about them at the end. Because I know there's a wide range of how libraries do it, and again, I'm not an attorney, but I'm still just recommending this. By my close read of the RSA is telling me that a contract is most legally appropriate. But we'll come back to that at the end, I'm sure. So now let's talk about what the RSAs have to say about the Board of Trustees as employer. So there is a lot in RSA 202A about what the Board of Trustees is responsible for, but this is the most pertinent one regarding their authority and responsibility. And I have used this particular RSA so many times that on a good day, I can quote it almost verbatim because I am so familiar with what it says. The library trustees shall have the entire custody and management of the public library and all of the property of the town relating thereto, including appropriations, but accepting trust funds. So, a common misperception among people who are peripheral to the library, and that might even include some of either yourselves or people on your library trustee boards, sometimes, or maybe even often, people think that the library that the Board of Selectmen has some jurisdiction over the library. But that is not true. In fact, the Board of Trustees may be described as the selectmen of the library. Now, in other RSAs, the Board of Selectmen and also the Budget Committee may be granted some authority over certain aspects of what the library is doing in certain circumstances, but that is really not the norm in the area of, certainly not the library as an employer. It's not the norm in most areas, but it's absolutely not the area or the norm in the area of the library as an employer. And that has been not only referred to in this statute, the library trustees having the entire custody and management of the public library, it's also gone to the New Hampshire Supreme Court. I think it was in the 1990s that it was this case, Town of Littleton versus Catherine Taylor, where it was established absolutely clearly that library employees are not employees of the town, they are employees of the library. So that is relevant when it comes to employment policies. It's not the Board of Selectmen's policies, it is the library employment policies. One of the ways that that can affect your library is, for example, in my library, we define in Newington, I actually don't remember in Epping right now, but in Newington, where I'm the director, we define full-time as 35 hours a week. Well, the rest of Newington departments, and that includes both the town hall, but also both of police and fire departments, they all fall under the town's personnel policies, and they define it as 40 hours. So I have the potential to get health benefits at 35 hours in my library as director, but 35 hours in other town departments don't have that. There are other ways that our policies do not favor the library, but in that particular case, they do. So, but it is up to the library trustees to make those policies, make those decisions for themselves. They can mirror the town's policies if they wish, but they can also write their own depending on what they think is in the best interests of the library. One of the ways that things can get a little confusing for board members, and also sometimes for library employees or other people when they're first diving into this, is payroll, because library employees may receive payroll through the town. It is not necessarily the case that libraries have their own EIN number, which is the Employment Identification Number. It's not always the case that libraries do their own payroll, but it is more like the duty of payroll has been delegated to the town in that instance. It does not mean that the town has control over payroll, over the library employees, over the budget. There are budgetary ways that the town has control, but not specifically payroll or anything to do with employment. So it's important to understand that the Board of Trustees is the employer and the Board of Trustees has that custody and management as employer. So these are paraphrases, but they are still um, details of what the board's responsibilities are according to the RSA 202A or 202A6. Is it 202A, 202A6? I'm drawing blank whether it's 202 or 202A or just 6, but so but these, while I said they're paraphrases, but it is still pretty close to the verbiage in that RSA. So you need a minimum of 3 board members, and it's always going to be an odd number to be able to vote and have, majority vote making decisions. You can have up to 3 alternates permissible. We can talk more about alternates at the end if people are curious about them. Sometimes there's some confusion about duties of alternates, and we'll talk about those later. You know how we talked about the responsibilities that were unique to the director in the beginning? Like, there's no other place in RSAs that says there should be anyone else that has the education to provide leadership in the use of books and materials. Like, that's not what the board has to do. RSAs don't say the board has to do that. Same with being the administrative officer of the library. Board is not doing that either. Same with recommending the hiring, or actually I would extrapolate to say recommending the termination of employees to the board. But these are what the board responsibilities are, library trustees. So first of all, adopting bylaws and policies. So bylaws are the rules that a board creates for itself. It will define the officers' duties, like the chair, the vice chair maybe, the secretary, the treasurer. Also, I would add that because I've seen in bylaws sometimes there's this, I should add that the bylaws and policies need to comply with the law. You can't override the law in your what you create. So for example, sometimes people put in bylaws that you can remove a trustee if they have missed 3 consecutive meetings. You can't do that. Trustees are elected, so they have to stay on the board. Even if they never come to meetings, they're still considered a trustee until their term is up, or until they resign and allow another trustee to take over. So the rest of the board can't do that. But what the rest of the board can do is remove someone from office. They can remove someone as chair or secretary or treasurer, because those are powers that can be granted by the rest of the board. The bylaws would tell what those are. If you're writing your bylaws, or if you need to review your bylaws, if you haven't ever reviewed them before, you need to look out to make sure that they are consistent with the rest of this RSA 202A6 or RSA 202, because sometimes they're not. Sometimes they give you powers that you don't legally have. So, all right. So the other 3 here that are detailed in the RSAs about what the board responsibilities are to grant non-resident privilege. So that means who else can become a resident, or sorry, have a library card, and how, if there's going to be a non-resident fee and how much it's going to be. And then the last 2, which can be sources of confusion, preparing a budget and expending funds, and then hiring and firing employees. These are 2 where it's really easy for that line to get blurred, because I know in a lot of libraries, including my own, it's actually the director who's preparing the budget. I think it's worth noting that the RSA does say the board should prepare the budget. So even if you're in a library like mine where it is the director who is creating the spreadsheet that has all the categories, and maybe looking at what every year, what line item might need to be increased because we keep overspending it, it's a really good idea for it to be spelled out in the job description that the board is delegating this responsibility to the library director, because again, if it's saying in the RSA that it's the board responsibility, then it is a delegation to have the library director doing it. But for example, in Epping, it's the treasurer who builds that budget, who prepares it, and who makes recommendations about lines going up or down. I would argue that no matter who is actually creating the spreadsheet, whether it's the treasurer, whether it's the director, the board as a whole should do their very best to understand the budget and to understand what the line items mean and to notice those trends. So it's not just the library director or just the treasurer looking at those lines. Those are important aspects of your responsibility, given that the board has the entire custody and management of the library. It's really your job, as much as or more than the directors, to say, why is this line always getting overspent? We need to look at maybe increasing it in the next budget and asking the town for more money, or maybe there are ways we can cut costs and maybe we should be looking into that. So that's the kind of thing that you should be aware of so that you can have a say in it, and also to answer questions from the town, because it is your fiduciary responsibility if you look at the RSAs. Okay, and then the hiring and the firing of employees, like we said in that former RSA, the director is making recommendations about this, but ultimately it is the board's responsibility and authority to do that. So it's super important in that situation that even if you have you've given your director a lot of leeway and responsibility for managing their employees, which, you know, I applaud that. I absolutely applaud that. You still need to remember that when it comes down to it, it is the board that hires or fires. So it needs to be done in a meeting, and it needs to be voted on by a majority if you're hiring or firing. So it needs to be moved and then voted on by a majority. And while you can do that, and you should do, if you're firing, you should probably do the majority of it in a non-public, there should still be a record that a vote was taken in a public, even if you're not specific in it. There should still be a record that's relatively easy to find, largely because, let's just think about this from a legal standpoint, which is what I'm trying to do with this presentation. From a legal standpoint, if you don't have a record that in the minutes, non-public or public, that says this employee was fired or terminated by the board, if that employee opposes the termination and asks for a public hearing, or even just doesn't ask for a public hearing, just like gets an attorney and says, I was fired without cause, which they can totally do in New Hampshire because it's not an at-will state for library employees, then they could very well get their employment reinstated, because technically, legally, the director, even if there's paperwork saying the director signed a termination of some kind, you know, then the director doesn't have the legal authority to do that on their own. So it has to be taken care of in a meeting by the board and legally voted on. So just bear that in mind. That is the legal responsibility of the board, not the director, even if they are performing all of the disciplinary procedures. And the board needs to be familiar with those disciplinary procedures for that exact reason, because it's ultimately a board decision. All right, so these are some of the other aspects of board responsibilities, and they're, again, my paraphrase in this case, not necessarily verbiage from the RSAs, but these are areas that can have conflict arise when it comes to questions about authority for directors and trustees. So on the board of trustees, it's the power resides in the majority. So like what I was just talking about, if there's a termination of employee that needs to happen, it needs to be a majority of the board voting on that. And same with hiring, the majority of the board needs to vote on it. One trustee has no standing to make demands of the director. So this is something that needs to be addressed by the chair if it's happening. If individual trustees are giving instructions to the director and it's not documented in a meeting, it hasn't been discussed and voted on in the meeting, and it's not appearing in policies or in the director's job description, this is overstepping and it is not going to lead to anything good. Even when it's the chair doing it, the chair only has authority that's granted by the rest of the board, and it really tends to go down a bad path if the chair is starting to give a lot of instruction that the rest of the board is totally unaware of. Even though it can work for a while, I've seen it backfire the more time goes on. So it's important to recognize that in meetings is where the power lies. In policies, in meetings, and in votes with the majority of the board. So as we talked about earlier, it is a unique management situation in that trustees may be supervising work that they've never done. They might never have even been supervisors, let alone worked in a library or been a supervisor in a library. So that's where I want to give you all credit for coming to conferences. It's important to read the RSAs on your own. It's important to take advantage of all of the materials on the NHLTA website, and also in our awesome newsletter that comes out quarterly. I really can't overstate how excellent the quality of the newsletter, the content of the newsletter is. I know I contribute to it fairly frequently, and I'm not talking about mine. I'm just saying, like, honestly, I'm more critical of what I put in than anybody else's. I try. We all try. But everyone who contributes offers so much valuable information in those newsletters. So definitely read those. And just remember that even though you have this authority over the library, you may not know as much about the library function as the people who work there, and so it's really important that you try and to broaden your understanding. And the last point here is well-researched and frequently reviewed policies are essential, and we're going to talk more about policies on the next slide. But I do want to say that that's a piece of it, is that the library trustees really need to do their homework regarding the policies that they put in place and make sure that the policies are appropriate for their library and are consistent with the laws that govern the management of libraries, and then also with the professional expectations you have of your director and staff. So policies are really important, and if you're not familiar with them already, there's usually 2 sets of them at your library, and if there aren't 2 sets of them, sometimes they're in 1 set, but a lot of times there's 2. One of them is usually day-to-day management kind of policies, and that would include some of them that are based on the law, like there's one about library confidentiality. There's an RSA about library confidentiality, and the expectation that patrons have to not have their the materials that they're using at the library become something that is just given to anyone who asks, or is gossiped about or whatever. So that would fall under a policy that you should have at your library, clearly available for anyone to read if they want. And there's a whole bunch of those policies that are about day-to-day operations of the library. But there should also be a set of policies that are personnel policies. And so those are the ones that detail how you want your employees to function and what your employees' obligations are, and also what your employees' rights are, and their meal breaks and their compensation and maybe their paid time off, and those are the personnel policies. So both of those sets of policies serve as the guidelines for the director, and they are the way that the that the board give the director their stipulations about how they want the library run in certain situations. So the director is going to hopefully have a role in creating the policies, but ultimately it's the policies are basically a director, the direction that given to the director that talks about what should happen in certain situations in the library, like how you keep confidentiality of patrons safe and that kind of thing. And then the policies would be created with the directors would manage the library within the boundaries set by policy. So this is the way that even though trustees have this custody and management of the library, they're not there 40 hours a week. They're not there even maybe 10 hours a week. They might, even if they're in every day, so the director is there and managing. So since the board has that custody and management responsibility, the policies are how the board manages. And you're going to want the library director to have a say in this, but you also want to remember that it's the board's responsibility to create those policies, and it's my recommendation that it be a board member who ultimately writes the policies, because the director might have a slant on the policy that doesn't actually fit what the board's expectation is. So, so it's just my personal recommendation that maybe the secretary be the person who's updating the policies and then distributing them and including to the director. That's not required by law. It's just my opinion of what the best practice is, because it makes sure that the trustees are the ones that are creating the policy. So before we move on to the federal employment statutes, I do want to add regarding the policies, there are a couple of places that you can find sample policies that you can use to enrich your own, either to create policies you don't currently have, or develop ones further and learn more about how libraries can handle different things. So the New Hampshire State Library is one of those examples that you can go to their website and they have some sample policies. Same with nhlta.org. We've got some sample policies on there. You can also just Google library policy about such and such, and if you want to be sure it's a New Hampshire library, you can, stick the New Hampshire search term in there. But because you should be aware that a lot of policies in other states are going to reflect the laws about libraries in other states. So you can read about those, but you shouldn't assume that they are going to be compliant with New Hampshire laws. But still, it's really useful to read as many policies as you can, and use that to build your own individual library policies that suit your community and your library the best that they can. Okay, so finally, the federal employment statute slide here is it's really it's not just federal employment, because most of these statutes have correlating New Hampshire statutes as well, but these come from federal laws. So and they apply to all employers. So the others that I was showing you in this slideshow were really about New Hampshire RSAs applying to public library management. When there is a board of trustees who has the custody and management over the library, and with a librarian that they are supervising. So in this case, we're not talking about laws that are unique to libraries. We're talking about laws that are cover all employees. And so each of these, not only do they need to be followed in your library, but they also need to be posted. the New Hampshire Department of Labor cares whether these are posted. So equal pay is New Hampshire RSA 275-37, and it's regarding it's illegal to pay employees different wages for the same work based on sex. So if your employer has violated this provision, you need to contact the New Hampshire Department of Labor, and that should be that particular RSA should be posted. Same with the Whistleblowers Protection Act, RSA 275E, and then some other follow-up RSA sections regarding rights and remedies, regarding a public or private employee who in good faith reports an alleged violation of the law, or objects to or refuses to participate in an activity that the employee believes is a violation of the law. That's what the Whistleblowers Protection Act is protecting, and then there are rights and remedies if these things are not addressed, that then are legal rights of the employee. So that needs to be both followed and then also posted at your library. And you can find these at the New Hampshire Department of Labor website, and I'm actually going to be looking for updated ones of these on Monday, because and having them ready, printed out and ready on Tuesday, because the ones I have are a few years old from the 2019 version I did of this workshop. And so I want to have the most up-to-date ones, because we should have the most up-to-date ones in our libraries, because those would have the up-to-date contact information. Another one is the Workers' Right to Know Act, which is the RSA 277A, and it's about toxic substances in the workplace. And even if you don't have toxic substances in your workplace, which a few libraries would, you have to have it posted that your library, that you know you have the right to tell your employees about those toxic substances. So that would be an example of something that has to be posted, and that the Department of Labor cares whether you have posted this. And finally, and these are not the entirety of the federal employment statutes that apply to all employees, but I'm going to try and add to this on Monday. But USERRA is another example in which it's the Uniformed Services Employment and Reemployment Rights Act, and that covers if someone goes out, an employee is deployed for military service, and they're employed by the library. They need to have their job ready for them when they get back. They need to have the same pay and benefits they would have if they hadn't left, and they need to have they need to not be discriminated against based on their military service. So all of those are aspects of the responsibilities that, as an employer, the Board of Trustees have toward their employees. And hopefully I'll have a few more of those ready on Monday. So, and for Tuesday, I mean. So that completes my presentation. And now we would love to move on to the Q&A with myself and Rosemary. So here we're going to do questions. In this slide, I don't know why it does not say what it should say. It should say Q&A with Rosemary Darcy and Laura Berry, and it does not say that, so I'm going to fix that. But we want to allow you all to ask questions about anything that was unclear in the presentation, and also about your own situation. So first, I will turn it over to my colleague Rosemary to tell you a little bit about her experience and expertise, and then we will start finding out what you want to talk about.